we still have a presenter, Dr. Matlou, who presented last week. We had a wonderful talk from him, and the time was just enough for him to present the first part as the historical discourse on his topic. This morning we are privileged to have him around again, and he's going to present the second part of his topic. And we are also privileged to have Dr. Obadele Campbell to chair this program for us. Dr. Obadele Campbell is a research fellow at the Institute of African Studies. He's particularly interested in anything African, any language African. And we believe that he will do a very good job to stir affairs for this program. He has a number of publications to his credit, and I believe that this program will be successfully conducted by our praised and worthy Obadele Campbell. Thank you very much, and do enjoy the presentation.
Okay, I attended the lecture last week, and since that time I've gotten to know Dr. Matlou. So apart from just the general reading his resume, since his presentation on Thursday, he accompanied me to Somania to speak to youth who are interested in Pan-Africanism and African thought. And that was a rousing discussion. We went to the Chaliwati Festival together. We went to African Women's Day together. And on our way to and from these places, we had rousing discussions. He spent most of his formative years here in Ghana, learning at Aquinas, going on to Presec. He's accomplished many things in academia, in scholarship. But when we were driving, I said that I was pleased to meet one of the very first Africans I've met since I've come to Africa, in the sense that for me, from a linguistic sense, I don't consider you African unless you speak a language from outside of the Berlin Conference borders that you were confined to. And he met that criteria because he speaks Kiswahili, he speaks, of course, Stymied and Tshwane, which are his native languages. He speaks Chi, he speaks Yoruba. I say anywhere I go on the continent, I can speak with him. So he is an actual African. So, you know, I was very pleased to meet him, and he will continue with his discussion on reflections on the UN International Decade of People of African Descent. So we are all honored and very privileged to meet this actual African here in Africa. And with no further ado, I'll turn it over to Dr. Matlou.
Dr. Obadele Oshegon. Good morning, and thanks very much for us engaging again today. I learned my lesson last week that I had too many slides. I have a lot today, and I'm going to not necessarily speak to all of them. I'll leave them on the screen as I speak, in order that you can engage with them. And of course, we are speaking about this decade that the UN declared on the 1st of January this year until the 24th December 2024. Now, we had last week already given a prelude to this, that this decade is located within a number of other projects, going all the way back to the UN 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights and various other conventions of the UN, but importantly, the 2001 Durban Conference on Racism and Xenophobia, which recognized that the slave trade was genocidal, and it was a crime against humanity. And it is on that basis that 2007 was declared the International Year of People of African Descent, and then, of course, this particular decade. Now, I thought to locate this within Kwame Nkrumah's speech to the OAU in 1963, where some of the things he said there today, many leaders continue to speak to even today. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but it makes an important point about unity, and that we are going to perish if indeed we continue to operate within the boundaries of the Berlin Conference of 1884, and that imperialism was getting stronger, the Cold War was on, and the war, I think, was still taking place in Algeria, Southern Africa. Armed struggles that started in various countries, and of course, Africa was caught in between. There had been the Bandung Conference of 1955 in terms of non-alignment, but we were caught in the middle one way or another. And I think importantly, as Walter Rodney, in his book, How Europe and the Development of Africa, raises the issues about the fact that the engagement, he speaks to Europe, but I think before that is the Arab slave trade, that as foreigners have come onto the African continent, it has been as part of a system of underdevelopment which has been created, that as Europe, the Americas developed, the Industrial Revolution was taking place in England, Africa was underdeveloped. Kwame Nkrumah speaks about global stock exchanges. He speaks about the minerals of Africa and the necessity to add value to those minerals on the African continent. And I'm sure many of you would know that when we talk, as we said last week, when we talk about cocoa, people don't think about Ghana, they think about, the Belgians in terms of chocolate or the Swiss. When we talk about gold, it is removed in its raw form and it's transformed into other products. When we go to other parts of the world, we talk about platinum, and we talk about, catalytic converters for cars, aeroplanes, and so on and so forth. Boeing, Airbus, none of those being on the African continent. So he talks about common planning, common endeavor. And African leaders have continued to talk about these issues. Today we talk about Africa 2063. Prior to that, there was the 1980 Lagos Plan of Action, the Abuja Treaty, the African Economic Union, and so on and so forth. That it looks like we plan and then we move the goalposts forward. As the time comes for when we should have achieved something, then I say, well, look, maybe if we continue planning, people will think that we are serious. Kwame Nkrumah has a lot of things to say, but fundamentally, this speech was around unity. And you remember that the OAU was the eventual compromise between the Casablanca group and the Monrovia group, because people like Kwame Nkrumah were saying unity now, and others, Nyerere amongst others, were saying no gradually. And of course, the French in particular, through the Casablanca group, wanted to ensure that even though they had left the continent in large measure, starting in 1958 in Guinea, Conakry, and then 1960, where about 15 of their countries, African countries were given independence, and where France had ruled basically in two major blocks, French Equatoria, West Africa, and the other parts, Madagascar and others. When it now came to independence, it was a case of breaking these countries up and ensuring that then France would play these countries as pawns. And France was actually pivotal in ensuring that the dream of people like Kwame Nkrumah and others was not met in 1963, and saying that Kwame Nkrumah wanted to be the president of the whole of Africa and so on and so forth. And indeed, if he wanted to be, so what? We would have needed a president anyway, so it would have been Nkrumah or somebody else. So I think importantly, they will create the European Union, they will create the United States, they will create the North American, Free Trade Association and others, dealing in blocks. But when it came to Africa and other parts of the world, they sought to ensure that we were not united moving forward. So I think, Kwame Nkrumah ends that without necessarily sacrificing our sovereignty, we can forge a political union based on defense, foreign affairs, diplomacy, common citizenship, and a common African currency. Things which up till today, 52 years later, after the OAU was formed, and then the AU was then formed in 2002, we're still talking about these issues. And of course, this was even a compromise, because indeed, if we were still keeping our sovereignty, what exactly did it mean? And I think this is where then the OAU comes out with borders that are inviolable. You cannot interfere in the internal affairs of another country, so that when Idi Amin was committing genocide in Uganda, there was nothing that you could do about it. If there was a civil war in Nigeria, it was Nigeria's problem, and the rest of the African continent could do nothing about it. So I think it is important that we keep on going back to this speech and ask ourselves, how come the things that Kwame Nkrumah was talking about 52 years ago have got that. I started talking about the reparations agenda last week. I won't spend too much time on it. Safe to say that indeed in 1993, the OAU was talking about reparations. And it raises a number of fundamental issues. It locates the slave trade as a challenge and the necessity for reparations. Looks at the damage that African people sustained there as not a thing of the past. It continues to haunt us today. The system of underdevelopment that was laid, the foundations of which the foundations were laid at that time, continue to haunt us today. And the OAU makes the important point that the Germans continue to pay reparations to the Jews long after the European War of 1939 to 1945. We're talking about what, 65 years on after that. We're talking centuries back, starting with the Arabs in the 7th century, the Europeans in the 15th century, when Africans were enslaved. The United States paid American Asians who were interred during that particular war, and there are various other parts of the world. The Aborigines in Australia, the Inuits in Canada, and the Maoris in New Zealand are among some of the people who have gotten some recompense. And of course, the Spaniards and the Brazilians did oppress people in Latin America, and in places like Bolivia, there's an attempt at some form of recompense. But certainly for Africa, it has not been the case. The EU has said, well, look, it was individual European countries at that time, Britain, France, Germany, Holland, Italy, Spain, amongst others, that were the colonialists in Africa, and not the EU as well. So we cannot hold Europe responsible. There has been reluctance to accept on public platforms by European leaders, certainly of those 7 or 8 countries that colonized the African continent, to admit guilt. It has been reluctant because they know if they do that, then it opens the doors to say, well, if you admit guilt, then there should be some form of compensation. There is the issue of reparations not being one of Africa globally. Africans who remain, the Cedis and others in Asia, those who remain in the Americas, those in other parts of the world. So reparations cannot be an African continental issue. It requires the global African nation to take into account. So already at this time, the 6th region concept then begins to be propagated by the OAU, and it happens about 9 years later in 2002, in the AU protocol on the Constitutive Act of the AU to change a part of it which makes provision for the diaspora to be the 6th region. And importantly is the fact that that protocol is not in effect because the requisite number of AU states that must ratify it to allow for the 6th region has not been done. So we can talk about the 6th region, but in reality, in terms of international law and whatever benefits that people in the diaspora can then put forward and say, look, in terms of the Constitution, A, B, C, D, E, that cannot be the case because we don't have the requisite number of countries. So I think it, again, even as we have this summit, and for an institution like the Institute of African Studies, I think part of what we should be resolving around here is to encourage, I have not checked in other slides, I'm sure I have the information, whether Ghana, for example, is a signatory and has ratified that protocol, and that Ghana, as the cradle of Pan-Africanism on the African continent, should be leading the fight, certainly within ECOWAS and other regions of the African continent, to ask African leaders what is the problem about ratifying this protocol. I think that, again, without spending too much time on this, is a recognition that the OAU at that time, and if you look at the second last paragraph I put in brackets, that much as we talk about Europe, the Americas, and those developments, the OAU at that time was silent on the Arab nations. Unsurprisingly, 1/3 of this continent is occupied by Arab nations in North Africa, parts of Mauritania, Algeria, Tunisia, Morocco, Libya, Egypt, and Algeria, and Sudan. So in a sense, Africans are reluctant to point the finger at Arabs and say, but wait a minute, your ancestors, and you're coming onto this continent, because you're coming from Arabia, Yemen, and other places, was an enslavement and a colonizing mission. So I think as we continue to hide and pretend that, between Arabs and Africans, we are all oppressed in the same manner, without recognizing that the Arabs were participants in one of the most vicious acts against Africans, who will continue to be blinded. And of course, much as we admire Kwame Nkrumah, some of the criticism against Kwame Nkrumah was the fact, let's leave his marriage aside, and that was a political marriage in order to ensure supposedly some form of unity between North Africa and the rest of the African continent. But I think that was a compromise that we certainly in South Africa, in terms of the compromise of Nelson Mandela of 1994, means that we have accepted whites as compatriots. But what that has done is that we have maintained the economic structure set. We can say politically there is equality and all, but the economic structure which started from 1652, when white people came into South Africa, remains today. Where in 1910 the British took that country and gave it in an act of parliament to the Afrikaners and the British. Meaning that by 1913, when the Land Act comes to be, 93% of African land is given to people who had come a few centuries before. So I think it is important to understand these issues, and that, where we need to critique what we see as icons, we should do that. And I assume, and hopefully rightly so, that I'm in a university and there's freedom of thought and freedom of speech. So even as I walk out of here, I'm sure I'll be safe. One, because I'm in the Kwame Nkrumah Institute of African Studies, but I'm a visitor to Ghana, and I hope when I want to leave on the 5th of September, I'll be able to go back. So I indicate the source of where the OAU raises these issues, and I have called for a resolution, Dr. Campbell, that the Institute, it behoves the Institute to lead the fight for the AU to have a ratification of its protocol, changing the Constitution Act. This is just a part of the history I gave you earlier, but I think importantly here is the year 1994, when Haiti and a number of African countries then had lobbied, and eventually the slave route project was launched both in Cuba and in Benin, not too far away from here in Ghana, that would have a slave project recognizing, amongst other things, scientific research, living memory in terms of monuments, whether it is your Usher Fort, Souk Castle and the other castles, the Door of No Return, Gorée Island, and of course monuments in the diaspora, and then of course encounters, transformation, where people from the diaspora come into the African continent, and of course the contributions of enslaved peoples to the development of nations like the United States, the UK in terms of the Industrial Revolution and others, which are not recognized. Quite often we are told that Africans were taken only for their strength, for their brawn, but that they had no brains. But the plantations could not have run. We know that the enslavers remained eating and drinking inside when Africans were planting, working, building the roads, the railways, and others in these parts of the United States, and of course, as well as in the UK, the Industrial Revolution would not have moved forward if that cotton was not coming from the Americans. So I think this slave route project is also an important one, and again, in terms of scientific research, I would want to hear to what extent the University of Ghana and certainly this institution is involved in this project. We just celebrated 20 years last year. We've spoken about how come, the genesis of this decade, and we refer to the Durban Conference in 2001, and I think importantly is the declaration which recognized that slavery was a crime against humanity, and that African peoples were victims of slavery and colonialism and continue to suffer the debilitating effects of that. We'll talk about underdevelopment today. We'll talk about our coffee, cocoa, gold, platinum, and others going to other parts of the world in their raw state, when Walter Rodney talks about us being producers of what we don't consume and consumers of what we don't produce. It's an example of that. My apologies on this slide. I was trying to be fancy, so that they don't say I was before technology, but be that as it may, it speaks to these very issues around, various declarations, days of remembrance, March 25th, with the victims of slavery, and the resolution on the decade of people of African descent, UN resolution, in 2013, 23rd December 2013. We'll not spend too much time on this. Safe to say, it asks the Secretary General to ensure that there is adequate funding for this decade. And these are the things that we are asking that you ask your Ministry of Foreign Affairs in terms of the Ghanaian mission to the United Nations, whether indeed these things are happening. These are the objectives of the decade: to promote respect, protection, fulfillment of human rights and freedoms of African peoples. As much as this decade is talking about African peoples, I think it is important to recognize that it's not only African people that have been enslaved, and we'll come to a slide to show you modern slavery that is happening today. Go to the Middle East and you find Filipinos, people on the Asian subcontinent who are being used to develop the Middle East, amongst others, who find themselves as victims of human trafficking. I think it's promoting greater knowledge, strengthening relations between national, regional, and international bodies, adapting and strengthening international frameworks for human rights. And then there are different levels. At the national level, and this is a question that we must ask in terms of Ghana at the national level, to what extent are there concrete and practical steps to ensure that the national and international legal frameworks ensure that there's a combating of racism, intolerance, xenophobia, and particularly against females and young males. Ghana being the country that is open, we see on the news sometimes that there have been raids against people who might have come into this country legally, were participating in your gold fields illegally, getting land from the chiefs, with environmental damage and stuff. The question is, without pointing fingers at only the Chinese, one must ask the question is, why is the state allowing that to happen? These are important questions that we have to ask, which in themselves are part of what led to slavery, and if we're not careful, we might see ourselves in the same situation. The question of recognition, the right to equality and non-discrimination, education on equality and awareness, because Africans in the United States today, we talk about Ferguson, we talk about Zimmerman in Florida, we talk about Michael Douglas and others, we talk about the 9 people who were killed in South Carolina in the church earlier on this year by somebody in his early 20s who had racist apartheid flags and Rhodesian flags in his room. These are questions that we have to ask. And in terms of information gathering is important, and educating young people about the past, because quite often when you talk about these things, people can't see. When you talk about slavery today, people say, well, that was centuries ago. Why do you keep on mentioning it today? Because if we forget our history, we could possibly be victims in the future. I'll jump to justice. And again, this is where we locate the fight on reparations. Justice in terms of what has happened to Africans, recognizing, number one, just like in South Africa, there was, the TRC, Truth and Reconciliation Commission. There is a necessity for a commission on slavery to say that there must be a recognition of what happened to African people. And then there must be justice. Because I think quite often, justice is swept under the carpet, and people are told, oh, you can forget about it. Now we've recognized that it was a wrong, and leave it at that. Then we are told, oh, we'll give you foreign aid, we will cancel your debts, and so on and so forth. But most of that money that they're giving you is money that they were taking illicitly from Africa anyway. That's the issue of affirmative action. We know that in the United States, what is known as affirmative action or programs for minorities are being rolled back on a daily basis. So we've got to say, and particularly with an African American president in power for the next 1.5 years or so, say, but what is he doing to ensure that, yes, he is the president of the whole United States, but how is he ensuring that in terms of this particular decade, the United States in particular, as Martin Luther King says, will there be justice? When his speech on March on Washington in the 1960s. Then there's development. Because indeed, after you had this justice and recognition that Africa has been underdeveloped, one, because millions of our people were taken, our people were in their prime, developed other parts of the world, we were underdeveloped in the process. How are we going to be developed ourselves moving forward? How are we going to unpack, unravel this particular system of globalization that we're told about today, which is actually a continuation of that globalization starting in the 7th century, which continues to hold African people in enslavement, even though that has been removed. Institutional racism, it has been removed from legislation and the civil rights legislation and so on and so forth. But the system is so deep and it remains institutionalized. Issues around language, religion, culture of utmost importance. We know that people's names were changed, they were torn away from their culture and the diaspora and others. How do we get these Africans and others linked back with this continent for those who want and see themselves as African? Because indeed, we must not be naive and think that everybody is going to say, well, just because I have the same skin color with you, I'm African. The media has played a very vicious role in ensuring that Africa is portrayed all the time as a continent of no hope. And then, of course, some people in the diaspora might say, well, I don't want to be associated with that. So I think we've got to recognize that also as a challenge. This just gives you an idea of what is supposed to be countries with the largest African diaspora globally. Brazil, of course, the United States, Haiti, Dominican Republic, all the way down to Trinidad and Tobago. This doesn't cover the whole world. Of course, in the Pacific. And quite often when people talk about the African diaspora, they forget the African diaspora almost annihilated in the Middle East, in Arabia, and also certainly in the Asian subcontinent. When you go to places like Ceylon, you go to places like India, there are people much, much darker than some of us in this room. And again, because of the caste system in India, the untouchables, and then at the top of society, the Brahmins and others, those people are right at the bottom. And we have got to ensure that in our struggle, we don't forget about this people. Last year in Johannesburg, in South Africa, in January, there was the 8th Pan-Africanist Congress, and they were invited to that Congress. And they were also asking that Africa does not forget them. That's an example of where some of those diaspora we're talking about are found. This is mainly in the Americas, from Canada in the north, all the way down to Argentina and Chile in the south of Latin America. This is just to give you an example. In the United States, Congress, and this is around, this would have been just up to the present, there have been only 8 senators in the United States Congress. So people who have been in that country, since the 15th century. And of course, if you see the United States got independence in 1776, well, since then, these are the only 8 people that you find. Gender, very unbalanced. And the Congressional Black Caucus in 2010 says, where numbers are important, black people are few. So in the important things, this is people in the United States Congress. And then, of course, this is a description of the United States, because quite often we lump it and look at it as one country, biggest economy globally. But when you disaggregate that population, black people are at the bottom. The next slide is looking at what you might call per capita income. For whites, it's $110 US average, and for African Americans, it's just under $5,000 US. Hispanics, who have come much later into the United States, doing much better. I'm told I have 30 more minutes. This is just another example that you may actually find that the black population in the United States, the people of African origin become they're going to become even much less at a certain point. Presently in 2010, they were just over, I think they've added non-Hispanics as well in there. But there is a case that you might find that the population might reduce, the population is increasing, more migrants coming in, and of course Donald Trump wanted to build a wall with Mexico so that more don't come in. And we say that, looking back, this was a few years back, and it was saying 50 years later, the promised land has not appeared yet. He might have seen the promised land, he did not get there. Certainly many more have not gotten there after him. I'm running out of time, but in terms of the international community, this is part of the work that the decade is supposed to do. Construction of a monument in front of the United Nations headquarters in New York, a midterm review by around 2020. Regional organizations like the AU, European Union, and others are supposed to undertake various activities, including things like, organizations like FIFA, amongst others, saying no to racism. We know a lot of African players are playing in various leagues abroad, and they throw bananas at them in places like Italy and Spain when they are playing. And we've got to find a way to combat this. In Russia, certainly many of the African players who have gone there have complained about the racism that happens out there. Again, allocation of funding by the SG Secretary General, public education by the General Assembly. We talked about the development of the monument in front of UN headquarters. And then a working group has been set up. One of the members of that working group is the daughter of Frank Fanon. He's based in Paris right now. And this is their work program. They meet biannually. They visit 2 countries a year. Sometimes they are asked to visit a country. So again, I urge Ghana, if they have not been to Ghana, to invite them over here to set up a program of work. And certainly, maybe again ask this institute to lead that push, working in collaboration with the United Nations here, and certainly your Ministry of Foreign Affairs and International Integration. This is the mandate of the group. The focal point for this decade is the United Nations High Commission for Human Rights. Again, we won't spend too much time on this. Safe to say, a lot of scientific work is being undertaken, reports are written, and where people complain that they are being discriminated against. And again, for the African American colleagues in here as well, I think pressurize your State Department, Senator Jim Kerry and your U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs, Linda Greenfield Thomas, she herself being an African American, put pressure on them to say what is the United States doing in relation to these issues, and invite the working group come out there as well, and any other people from other countries of the diaspora over here. Encourages the UN to cooperate with various development agencies looking at dealing with the issues of recognition, justice, and development. Significant dates. Last week, Sunday, the Pan-African Women's Day was commemorated in this very hall, and the significance of the 22nd and 23rd is because it's the anniversary of the fight in 1791 when Toussaint Louverture and others took up the fight against enslavement in Haiti and eventually won independence on 1804. And the 23rd is also a day of remembrance in relation to that. And then of course there's the 28th of the August, which is International Creole Day. I won't spend too much time on the Caribbean reparations. Safe to say they are the ones leading the global fight now. And many of the things that we've said about Africa also exist in the Caribbean, including their call for a return, if they can be allowed to come back to the homeland that they were cut off from centuries ago. I think that, again, it would be useful for African countries to engage with the Caribbean because, unfortunately, on the African continent, apparently Presidents Obasanjo and Mbeki at that time led the push when the issue of reparations was supposed to be on the Devon agenda to remove it because Europeans and the West had promised $64 billion a year to NEPA, which never came in the end. They deceived us during slavery, they continue to deceive us even now. Those who don't open their eyes will be enslaved again. These are just the 10 points that the Caribbean put out in terms of some of the issues that they believe the reparations program should cover. So first, European governments must admit responsibility, they must deal with illiteracy, there must be an African knowledge program, and then of course psychologically. I think quite often they underestimate the mental impact of enslavement, of underdevelopment of us as African people, and therefore why. In a sense, sometimes we don't walk tall, we don't walk proud, because for years, centuries, it has been trampled upon us to have inferiority complex and so even new peoples are coming into the African continent now, and they as well. Coming to Africa, and in no time, peoples from other parts of the world have many more benefits. But I am always very upset when I arrive at an airport like the Murtala Mohammed International Airport in Lagos, and we are all standing up to line up, and I find an immigration officer, which is a disgrace to the uniform that they wear, and certainly having been chief of immigration in South Africa myself, taking the travel documents of some passengers, most of them Asians and Caucasians, and going to process them before everybody else. So these are the questions we have to ask. Are we getting new enslavers and new colonialists on this continent moving forward? And for a country which is the biggest economy of the African continent, the most populated country of the African continent, and a country that says it is the leader of Africa, I think we must hang our heads down in shame and ask what is that. There are public health issues. Some people might say it's lifestyle diseases, but we know that people removed from their homelands, eating other foods and being in different environments. We hear that, if you have sickle cell anemia, for example, and you're on the African continent, you are able, through the environment and foods and stuff, to combat it. But we know in the United States, in the Caribbean, many people have sickle cell anemia and cannot deal with it, and many other challenges. So it is a health issue as well that we're talking about in relation to these matters. I will not, again, if you allow me, these again are just showing you the impact of underdevelopment and enslavement of the African continent. If you're on the United Nations Human Development Index, the highest is on a score of 1. So if you look, it's from 0 is bottom, Libya is at 0.784, and this is possibly before the 2011 conflict in Libya. So Libya at 0.7, while many European countries, Singapore and others, are at 0.9. And let me go, these are the 10 top achievers. I thought I had the 10 West achievers. But I don't have them there, but I try and compare the best and the worst on the African continent. And quite often, those on the left-hand side. Look at those countries. I'll show you a few slides. You will see, if you look on the left-hand side, Angola had civil war for a long time. Eritrea is a country which has virtually closed itself up. Guinea, the French pulled out telephone wires, tore fires in 1958 when they were leaving. Ethiopia, been at war a long time. Djibouti is surprising considering that, major US military base there. The US has kind of kept it as a one-party state for long. Sudan at war. Ivory Coast, recently civil war. Mauritania, one of the places where slavery still continues. Cameroon, rich cocoa producing coffee, rubber, oil and others, but somehow governance issues. I think I showed this slide last week, where when you look at the GDP of some countries, it's less than some of the information technology groups in the United States. We do have 10 more minutes. These are the worst performers in terms of the human development index. Sorry that I didn't put it next to the other one, but again, it's not surprising. DR Congo, a country which was ruled from 1884 to about 1905, 1908, owned by one person, Leopold, who was the ruler in Belgium. 10 million people killed for rubber because Henry Ford was setting up the you were setting up a car company, and this is where people were producing rubber for the tires out there. Let me not spend too much time on the Mo Ibrahim Index, almost a repetition, but again, high performance, low performance. There's Djibouti again, there's Cameroon again, Ethiopia, Somalia right at the bottom. Whereas Mauritius scores about 84, Somalia scores 8.6. Here I've spoken about some of these things. The only point I'm making here is, we keep on pushing our plans forward. That's all I'm saying here. The Lagos Plan of Action should have been, effected by 20,000. 1991 Abuja Treaty was saying 2027. The question is, are we going to get there? Corruption is a major challenge. Look at the amount of money Africa loses. This amount of money we lose is more than the so-called foreign aid and foreign investment. If we could just stop, under-invoicing and over-invoicing imports and exports, not collecting taxes from corporates. When Obama was in the AU, he was told, get your corporates to stop. And Obama is not going to stop it necessarily. We are the ones who must stop it. We have the laws. Why are we not prosecuting them? South Africa lost 122 billion, Nigeria was 158 billion. This is the Global Corruption Index. Botswana is about the best performer on the African continent. And that's an example of what we call modern slavery. Thousands. I mean, I went to Holland in 2011, and everybody who goes to Amsterdam, you're told, no, people smoke, the holy herb, with due respect, to my Rasta colleagues, and it's a meat market virtually when you get into it. And you find African women sitting behind glasses waiting for people, to come and sleep with them and to pay them. You leave Africa for them. Highly qualified Africans, some of them with PhDs, cleaning the streets of Europe, driving taxis in the United States. Talking about the massive breakdown. Yes, people say they send 40 billion annually back to Africa in terms of remittances. But couldn't they be here in the African continent, developing the African continent? Just give me 3 more slides. Way forward. What do we do? Yes, because we have analyzed the situation moving forward. Remember Kwame Nkrumah's speech? Is it going to be possible? We were divided to be ruled. Are we going to continue to allow ourselves to be divided and ruled? Governance. I've just been in Ghana a week. We call it load shedding in South Africa. You call it doom survey. Generators are winding away the whole day. Yes, in the rich estates. But what about the poor people? Why can't we solve the electricity crisis? Just had a conversation with 2 of my friends outside. I won't mention them. But they were saying people don't complain in Ghana. We complain in little groups. Are we going to be the same here in an intellectual gathering, that whatever we say remains here? We don't tell truth to power? We get the governments and leaders we deserve. If we believe that everything is all right, there's corruption, there's mismanagement, and Ghana is praised by the West and others, then that is the Ghana we'll have. Certainly we in South Africa are fighting tooth and nail because the new elite, the black elite, is virtually no different from the white elite. But I end this particular slide quoting Pliny the Elder, who lived between 23 and 79, a Roman elder, who said, "Ex Africa semper aliquid nova," from Africa always something new. They tried to enslave us, they tried to commit genocide against us. We survived. We are the first peoples of the earth. We will survive, but we have got to survive in a better state. Let me just leave you with a slide. This morning, listening to Joy FM coming here, there was a young gentleman who was speaking, who had been a student of a Jewish professor, and he was talking about nation building. And these are the 8 things that he mentioned, that you have to develop a vision for the nation. Yes, many African countries have visions. 2063, 2030, in South Africa call it the National Development Plan. But you have got to build the foundation for that vision today if it must indeed be realized at that time. And when you say 2063 or 2030, you are starting to count now, not 5 years down the line like many African countries do. Our vision 2030 is from 2011. We have hardly started implementing it. Okay, so Africans talk about African time as if there's 25 hours in a day. Ali Mazrui says we buy watches, now they're all on cell phones or smartphones and stuff. And the person who wears the watch as a jewelry piece. The meeting starts at 9, he arrives at midday. When the Chinese work 24/7, 365 a day, we say these Chinese are slaves, but that is what has built China. Do not accept things as they are. So we spoke about that earlier on. We in South Africa try not to accept that. And I also want to say, I mean, if we say we are all Africans, then if something is wrong in Africa somewhere, then I should be able to say it. Otherwise, it's like my foot is paining, but my heart can't tell my foot. So, you know, and if something is wrong somewhere in part of the body, eventually that disease goes into the rest of the body. So if something is wrong in Ghana, I'll probably say, and because I spent 9 years over here, you know, and had my first broken heart over here, so, you know, there's an affinity. I left part of my heart in this country. So I'm speaking as a Ghanaian, you know. Undertake moral boosting projects, you know, and start small. This is what this person was saying. And he started repairing the wall of Jerusalem. So, you know, the streets here, that we see and stuff. We were in Jamestown over the weekend at the Charlie Water Festival, and you know, why should people, fellow human beings, live the way they live? You know, I mean, are we happy as leaders? I mean, you know, do we then try, when foreign dignitaries are coming, try and move these people off? So again, you know, let's not accept the things that we're planning, effective organization, cutting things into manageable time frames, and you know, as they say, my surname Matlou means mother of an elephant. You eat the clove slowly, cut it bit by bit. Lead by example. You can't, as a leader, just say we should do this, but act differently. Lead by example. Prepare for opposition. There will be those who are going to say, he wants to be the leader of the whole African continent. He wants to oppress you, the rest of Africans. Why is Ghana's money being spent for freedom fighters and so on and so forth? Then, of course, eventually, who you? So be prepared for that. There must be justice, fairness, and equity. We must all, you know, I mean, I've come to Accra and we call them blue light brigades in South Africa. Here they are called black SUVs. You just drive it through the traffic and you blow your horn and everybody must give way. You know, reminds me very much of Animal Farm, you know, or Louis the 14th, they start them more and more to start. And you know, the state is me and I'm the state, and his wife saying, give them cake to eat. So these are just references, basically. Thank you very much.
Okay, a very rousing talk, and I will not abuse my position as chair because you know I like to be the one to ask plenty of questions. I'll open the floor for any questions, comments. Let's try to veer towards questions because the comments tend to go long, as we saw last week. So any questions? We'll take 3, and then we'll pause for Dr. Matlou to respond.
Thank you very much for such a wonderful presentation. I think that I have been grappling with this particular issue of Africa and our underdevelopment and all the problems that bedevil us. Sometimes it's very frustrating. And the last issues that you raised concerning what we can do, I'm trying to develop a paper on Africa and the problems that we have as a nation in code. And I realized that there's something about us that we are very repetitive. And we seem to almost repeat the negative things about us. And it has become cyclical. And I'm trying to, as it were, figure out where we get that from. And I realized that traditionally, our life is cyclical. We repeat things. Our dances are cyclical. Our everything that we do have a cycle. And I think that almost invariably it has affected us in a way. But as to why we repeat the negative things, I can give countless examples. Rubbish all around the place and all that. I mean, that is the issue. And I think that we have to look deeply into that.
Good morning. I was stand up, but I got all this up in my lap. I apologize. So this was another wonderful presentation. Thank you very much. The last slide, the way forward, the brother who was on the radio this morning talking about sort of these points. I thought they were all very significant. But I didn't see like transforming our political consciousness or ideology. So I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit to the role of ideology in political education and really sort of transforming our political consciousness in the way forward, specifically for the way forward for the African continent.
What role do you think religion plays in terms of empowering the African? Because I, as a black woman traveling in Ghana, a black country, driving through and seeing a picture of a white man who's portrayed as Jesus, the Son of God. So if God is white, I mean, what type of enslavement does it take for a black person to worship a white deity, to worship a person who looks so unlike you, and you elevate this person as your God? So I'm saying, to what extent do you think religion plays a role in the continued psychological enslavement of our people that would cause an immigration officer to single out white people and Asians and take them off the line saying, you're too good for this, you're better than these black people standing here. And if that happens to me in an airport, I say to them, in terms of my black immigration officer, why do you hate me? Is it because I'm black? So I call them out on it, because I've seen it here. I've seen it here at Kotoka International Airport. I've seen it in South Africa. I've seen it, in different places. We continue to do this, and I'm asking you, Dr. Matlou, to what extent do you think Christianity, in particular, and Islam too, reinforces these negative images, this valued image that we have been asked to accept of ourselves?
Thanks very much. I think the first intervention was a comment more than a question. But the three issues raised have a common thread through them. I think we must understand that enslavement was a project which was built on the premises of exploiting others, but dehumanizing. It's utmost important that we do not forget that the agenda was to use others as beasts of burden, and basically owning them, abusing their bodies, rape of women, rape of men, and using them, in wars and what have you. I mean, after all, the British brought the West African, the West Indian regiment over here, so you brought people who were slaves before, where you had enslaved before, brought them back to come and act as your compradors in colonizing or putting down others during the colonial process. So I think it is necessary to understand that. But that development, whether it is of plants or human beings, is a progression. And that's why whether it in political science, you would talk about people going from ordinary nomadic societies into communal, feudal, slavery somewhere in that process, back into the then industrial revolution and moving forward. So that interaction between human beings, because we are in the state of nature, as John Locke and others say, life is brutish. And the difference with human beings is that it shows in this room that we could have been outside, in our naked state, but this is a reflection of development. Language, taking, material things, turning them into lights, and so on and so forth. So yes, Africans produced, we're at a particular level in relation to other parts of the world, and at some times you talk about civilizations, which now the Arabs and others are claiming, but in Nubia, in ancient Egypt, in Aksum, the Mali Empire, Songhai, Monomotapa, you could go on mentioning that. Europeans were still running about half naked, and then of course there were voyages by Africans into other parts of the world. It is a cutting you off from your autonomous process of development. And then African societies never really, people talk about the fact that, again, where there's abundance, there is the sun. In some countries, I'm told in Uganda, you can throw a table on the ground and it will grow, just to show you how rich the place is. Now that in itself impacts psychologically on development processes. You have so much, so maybe we won't plan today to go to waste. Whereas in the cold climates, you had to get clothing to survive. You had to, so that spared development. Not that they were better than anybody else, their environment. As I learned in geography next door here, environmental determinism, condition and change. So these are important. And of course, then, the Chinese had gunpowder. They had science long before Europeans, and Europeans were able to take that, and therefore then the military might and ocean-going vessels much bigger than ours is what then they use to colonize the rest of the world. You've got to understand that. So then, religion also is not a European thing. They take it from other parts of the world and convert it to their benefit. So yes, Marx talks about religion as the opium of the people, and you are told to tithe, 1%, 10% of your salary, give the priest that. In South Africa, you can go on the internet now. They're making people eat dead snakes and dead rats. And women are told in some churches, do not wear underwear, come to church and the Holy Spirit will go into you. So it is a recognition that religion can be used for that. I was watching a film when I was in the United States last month. The Catholic Church kept in Boston, just in Boston in the United States, put aside $3 billion for the court cases for all the sodomy and rapes and abuse of people, altar boys and so on and so forth. I was in Aquinas here, and there were two reverend fathers. One was headmaster, the other one was teaching religion. And we are told Catholic priests are celibate. One had a child, one broke up a marriage. So we said, wait a minute, what's happening? So you can take, I think they are not condemning religion. I'm saying, as one of the issues around the way forward says, lead by example. If I remember, lead by example. So here it's the extent. So you as a thinking human being take the religion seat, and if the priest is doing what they shouldn't do we tell them? If your father is doing what he says you shouldn't do you tell your father? Or in terms of the so-called tradition, as I'm told, we mustn't speak back to elders and what? In South Africa it is the case. And if that was the case, then President Zuma is doing wrong. How then does his child Malema tell him? Because remember now, you're talking about tradition, but you have something called a parliament as well. And if I remember, in African parliaments, if you were there, yes, they discriminated against women, but if you were there, you could speak truth to the chief. And there are all manner of problems in general chambers, things fall apart and others. So you could tell the emperor that the emperor did not have clothes on. But now we have taken power, unfortunately, in the African context. We talk about the so-called big man and stuff, and you could not critique the person. There's something wrong with that. Children don't speak, so we then take tradition. No, in Africa, children don't speak. No, you don't speak directly to the chief. They're all so. We can take tradition and use it for any purpose. We can take religion and use it for any purpose. So yes, indeed, I think culture is the basis of development. I'm reading Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilizations, and basically civilization is described as a people's culture. Your culture is what we then say, in terms of, if we were looking at standards of civilization, this is what you did, and that is how you developed. So that's what we judge you by. But what do you judge Africans by today? If we are using Western standards to judge ourselves, of which they say you are not a part of, and I'm not fully Ghanaian or Azanian, as some of us call South Africa, then what am I? Then of course, obviously confused. I'm schizophrenic. That's why I would wear a watch and come to a meeting at 10 when it's supposed to start at 9. Because I think African time, but and this is not to say Africans did not have the concept of time organization and all. We were cut off from that. And therefore, the environments in which we operate in today are environments largely of an imposition of 500 years of Europe on top of us. Now it is China. In South Africa, they say we must study Mandarin. So they say Ni and but I can't speak, many of the other African languages. So the AU, we talk about languages in the AU, only Kiswahili is there, which in itself is partly Arab. But then you have French. We talk about ourselves as Anglophones, Francophones. And somebody said the next thing, the only thing we have not called ourselves is cell phones. So, you know, we take others, we take from others. And that is ours, we leave and we desecrate. So for me, in terms of religion, it has its use. But unfortunately, in the African context today, we're all just praying and hoping that manna will come. It doesn't work that way. Ideology and nation building, we didn't see here in terms of political consciousness, developing a vision, consciousness, do not accept things as they are, consciousness, undertake moral building. This is all a change process. This requires human beings to change. And of course, you will see the reflection in what then happens in terms of how we tame nature and the material things. Leading by example. You have to be transformed. You know, you have to have that African. If you say, I'm an African, what then does it mean? You've got to define that and live it. You know, prepare for opposition. Again, so these are all issues around transformation. So it's implied in what is said over here. And then of course, I mean, you know, our constitution says freedom of religion, so, you know, but then, you know, in a country like South Africa, for example, we talk about freedom of religion, but there is a dominance of foreign religions in terms of operation. And certain things that, you know, I mean, there is a young lawyer who has been fighting the legal fraternity for years because he would not be accepted in the so-called, you know, circle of learned brothers and sisters because he has, you know, dreadlocks. So there are all forms of gatekeeping and keeping people out. So, you know, you are told you must wear a suit. This in South Africa, we've said, some of us say, well, wait a minute. And, you know, I'm going to dress, you know, one the way I want to a large extent, and it's going to be a choice. So some of us will never see suits. You know, it's too hot. You know? So if I had to work in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs here, I had to go to a meeting like this. I don't know whether they want to listen to what I want to say, or they want to see.
Okay, we'll take the next round of 3 questions. I see someone already has the mic.
Thank you very much. In your submission, you remarked that one of our problems is that we are producers of what we do not consume and consumers of what we do not produce. I've recognized that the majority of us put minority in power to determine our destiny. That minority is controlled by that same force that took us to slavery. And so then, in our process of determining governance for ourselves, we end up being enslaved by these same leaders or misleaders. As majority, what can we do to change the status to us and to make us producers of what we consume and consumers of what we produce? Thank you.
Hello, my name is Nketia. My question is, how do you empower or enlighten the minds of youth? I ask this because I work at a radio station, and my job is to talk to, I'll say, the largest cross-section of Ghanaians youth from 16 to 25. And I'm seen to talk too much. I'm too argumentative. I like this black thing too much. We just want to talk. We just want to listen to music and want to hear about Nicki Minaj, Kanye West. That's it. Even with that, you try and twist it, and it's like she's getting to intellectual entertainment news. So how do you empower people's minds when they don't want to listen? Yeah.
Thank you. I find it difficult to direct my question to you, but I think it's more to everybody here because the story you just told us is known by some of us, and what are we doing about it? That's to us, because we will sit here and listen to you and clap for you, and then you will go and we will feel great. So what are we doing? I mean, what are we doing with our politicians? Do we have a platform where we work these things out? What are we doing as the Institute of African Studies? When I think of the religious hype going on and all those things, I think of a national platform for the sanctity of religion and the dignity of man. And if we put it together, we can start from there. I mean, about drugs, what the so-called soft drugs. I've been living in Holland for the past 28 years, and they've been smoking it. Children smoke it and stop. Adults have smoked it and stop, or they're still smoking it. And nobody is catching them and throwing them into jail. if you are a doctor here in Ghana and you're driving on the streets and they catch you with one spliff, as we call it, they throw you in jail, feed you nonsense, and destroy your life. I mean, what is that? What are we doing? So it's about our reawakening, and these are some of the things I want to mention. So I don't know whether it's directed at you or us as people attending this conference. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. I don't know, but I just want to ask this little question, that should we continue to maintain the same educational system we actually got from the from the colonial masters? Now, I ask this question because I grew up in a tradition where you accept things the way they are. You don't question the elder. And I have seen it happen in the developed countries where children have been moved to the streets to actually educate adults. They hold their placards, they write on it, they tell them don't do this and don't do that. Kwame Nkrumah did the same thing when he was president in Ghana. He actually targeted the kids and he was going to the schools and speaking to them. He made them to really believe in them. Should we continue to maintain the same educational structures where they tell us our mother tongue is vernacular? You speak it in the class and then you get some nice classes. Thank you.
You know, we arrived in Ghana a few days after your coup in 1966. And we then went to school in Nigeria, I went to school in Nigeria, 66 to 70. And, then came back, and that's when I started from two at Aquinas. So basically Ghana is molded me. So even as I stand here, I speak on the basis of that foundation from that time. And the Ghana that I grew up in was difficult, a champon study. I think it was Busia first, and a champon. The days when Busia was talking about dialogue with the Republic of South Africa. And we protested around some of those things. We were part of the student movement for African unity. And Ghana that you're talking about seems a totally different Ghana from the one that we knew. We protest against the champon. But there were also a few good things like Operation Feed Yourself under Benasco, and during the long vacation we used to go to Afenia and other places and harvest foodstuffs. And then of course there was the Rawlings era. We were just about finishing over here. And of course there had been student protests every year. Enjoyable first year, enjoyable second year. The third year you want to finish, so there was some form of division around that. We eventually finished in August. So, all I'm saying to you is that you have to be the change that you want in the world. Nobody's going to be that change. I speak to you as an African, and certainly coming back to Ghana, after a long time, and being able to, have the real Banku here, the Kinkis, not Fufu and Bessia, and Cocoyam and stuff. It's great. I mean, I'm just looking around at the change. Because as a social scientist and an observer, yes, I see in terms of buildings, traffic jams and huge SUVs and others, what you might call development, but I also see a lot of poverty as well. So, I juxtapose these things and we ask, we talk about growth, we talk about development, what is growth, what is development? So I think that, and I need not tell you, that's why I started calling Nkrumah. What is, like you say, I'm not saying anything is necessarily new. But if we don't repeat it, if we don't internalize it, if we don't become conscious, then of course, then you can read a country. And that's why I can say there's a qualitative difference, certainly in terms of, and I've only been around a week, so I can't really, we used to condemn Europeans, Robert Chambers and others who were airport sociologists. You come into a country a week and then you're suddenly an expert. So I have been away, so obviously, I can't, say in a week, what I've experienced, of course, has been so before I came here. Experience in South Africa as well. And it's like of learning inefficiencies and so on and so on. So I think you can only become a producer of what you consume, making a conscious effort about that. And at least one thing where there is a qualitative difference between African countries where the settlers were not as many and countries where they virtually embedded themselves. Nigeria, Kenya, Southern Rhodesia at that time, Zimbabwe, Angola, Mozambique, and Namibia, and South Africa. The difference in our countries is that the colonialists and enslavers were there. Here you have the West African Air Force, the mosquitoes, among others, which drove them. You see the heat and all that. I mean, right? In the streets of Accra now, you have apples all over the place. And, you can see, from the Rappi, ShopRite, these are South African apples, South African wine and all that. But for us as ordinary people, these are not the aspirations. I think this is where the difference in Ghana, that if you lose it, and it happens. You spoke about, media. The media is bombarding you daily with, the media wants your mind. The advertisements, and so-called lifestyle and all that. That you gradually move away from the other message, which is the message of who you are, the food you eat, and so on and so forth. So we would now be eating white rice and eating a lot of meat, and moving away from the healthy things, which then, in terms of South Africa, obesity, I mean, we are the most obese nation on the African continent, And, I was telling, a classmate of mine from PSEC, that when he saw me 2 years ago, because he looked at me and was wondering, I know in the time, there was Ebola and AIDS, and so he was thinking, well, has Matlou been taken as well? And I was saying to him, no, it was the treadmill that has made me what I am. I walked an hour this morning before, woke up at 6 and walked until then before 7 before coming here. Because indeed, we have got, the mind and the body have got to be healthy if we must create a healthy nation and move this continent forward. So, the more we wallow into, so-called lifestyles, unsustainable lifestyles, only a few can have them, consumption of energy and all that in the United States and others. Look at the SUVs on your roads here, huge V8 engines, You might be a petroleum producer now, but that doesn't last forever. People are looking at electrical cars, smaller cars, and so on. So it is of utmost importance that the elite are a conscious elite. If it's an elite of consumption, who put away billions in Swiss accounts and others, then, you have the situation that we have in many African countries. So empowering and enlightening, nobody empowers you. You have to take a conscious decision to be empowered. I knew that being overweight was unhealthy, but my sister family spoke about it, but, in Ghana, I used to call it patriotic front, and it shows your vision. And now that I wasn't working formally and was now consulting, I saw, you can't. So you can provide education, you can provide messages. You can lead a horse to a river, but almost always unlikely you can force it to drink. So most of what we can do is to educate, enlighten, but also to say, it is left for you to take the message that is coming to you and not just take it lock, stock, and barrel. Open your mind to it, and that's why we're supposed to be literate or educated and engage, whether it is with religion, whether it is with politics, so that you yourself, we are the change, as Mahatma Gandhi said, we would have to be the change that we want to see the world. It has to be in us. So, for me, those are the important issues. Trade, inter-African trade. Some of the things I'm talking to my colleagues about having come back here is to say, look, we talk about African trading among themselves at only 11 or 12%. ShopRite has come over here, it is only bringing things here. What are the things we can take from Ghana to South Africa? Obama on the 22nd of July signed the new AGOA Act. It is to get African goods duty-free in the United States. Over 4,000 of those goods, we only take in about 100, mainly clothing, so Chinese companies come in. And then we say, there's an increase in goods going to AGOA. And I was in the US twice this year, and there's a Ghanaian lady who runs a show called Nana International. She's importing yams, plantain, kokonte, you mentioned it, black soap, shea butter. And because, again, West Africans like their food wherever they are, so, there's a market there. There's a huge West African community in South Africa. There's a market. Clothes like this, South Africans that say, okay, we don't want to wear suits and stuff. Fortunately, they make them too expensive. And of course, the cloth is also Dutch or Indonesian, damask and things like that. And it's tie and dye from Nigeria. So, for us to become producers of what we must then, consumers of what we produce, there has to be a mindset change. There's Ghanaian food which is healthy. Get it into the shops. Why should ShopRite be only selling South African products over here? I stop watering the vegetables with the gutter water. Use clean water, because then we're going to poison ourselves. I see lots of vegetables and fruits around. Your mangoes are so sweet. But the problem that I've spoken to people in South Africa, they said the mangoes are sweet, the peanuts are nice, the quality must be consistent. And if we say 14 containers a month, but 14 containers a month, not 7 today, 2 next month, because we have created a demand. People are waiting for this Ghana mango now, it's not true. The vegetable. I learned how to eat cassava leaves and sweet potato leaves in Liberia, and we don't use those products. So again, I'm in a consulting business. I normally charge for this, but I'm giving for free.
Okay, we have just a few more minutes, and now I will slightly abuse my role as chairperson so that Irene will never ask me to do so again. Actually, yesterday I was looking at a documentary. I homeschool and office school my daughter, and in this documentary, and I have her do her reports in chief. Yes. This one was on the role of fire in human history, and it was talking about how that which stores the sun's energy in the form of carbon, our African ancestors found ways to unlock that in the form of wood, before charcoal, before coal, before oil. And we even have this with melanin and storing the sun's energy. And I wanted to ask you about the role of, you don't have time to answer, but the role of us transcending these ways of unlocking the sun's energy through solar power and things like that to transcend our dependence on what we do not produce and things of that nature, as that was brought up. I also wanted to inquire about, we talked about Nkrumah, with the political marriage of Fatia, and basically that as a move towards Arab integration and skirting around that issue. That in the far past, Tutmosis III, Utilise, did a similar thing, that the Hyksos invaded Africa, we re-invaded them, and then started to integrate these Arabs. So, I think one of the things is when we don't know our ancient history, then we're doomed to repeat it, because we're looking at Nkrumah trying to integrate with the Arabs. I think it's a new thing, but that's also what caused the destruction of black civilization, as Chancellor Williams brought up. I also wanted to inquire about the role of reparations, that sometimes reparations is talked about in terms of money, but others talk about reparations in terms of blood, that the Atlantic Ocean is the world's largest graveyard. So if we are talking about reparations, is that something that is also being discussed? There's a documentary called Stealing Africa, Why Poverty, that also talks about similar issues. Also, I wanted to bring up this idea of the CIA, where certain CIAs who were here said that they chose every single African leader since that independence time. So when we talk about choosing leaders, are we the ones who choose a leader? And then finally, this idea of, are we, doing what we should do? There, a question came up of, well, what do we do? Sometimes we as scholars, we do the same things that African governments do in terms of asking for grants, in terms of going to our village and getting raw resources and then giving it to them to prove their theories right. That do we ourselves, do something different that we ask African governments to do? So if you have time to answer those questions, which you don't, so we'll discuss them after, and I'll turn it over to Irene as I see her waiting in the room. And she will never ask me to be chair again.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. We are so grateful to you. The second part will continue. So all those who have time could wait and then have that discussion with Dr. Obadele Cameron and then Dr. Matlou. We thank you so much, and we are praying that next week you'll be here to take part in our third seminar. So thank you for everything.